House believes that porn has a place in sex education. And I look to Spencer Cohen, the Secretary of the Oxford Union, Brasenose College, to open the case for the proposition tonight.
It's almost a given. Any responsible parent would want to restrict their child's access to Pornhub. Any responsible parent would want to create a moral stigma around porn, convincing their children that pornography is wrong, dirty, and will rub off on whoever watches it. And it's also a given that any responsible feminist would want to restrict children's access to YouPorn. Any responsible feminist would want to shield children from the dystopian gender roles portrayed in mainstream pornography in order to break the cycle of gender-based violence and subordination it supposedly creates. So tonight, in order to convince you that porn deserves a place in sexual education, I'll ask you to forget about being responsible tonight in a conservative, traditional sense. I'll ask you to consider not just what a unique medium porn is, not just what it does, but also what it could be. I'll ask you to consider porn as something that can transmit values and ideas, both good and bad, and that porn itself is not responsible for most of the problems that the opposition will decry tonight. I'll argue that it's a place that's both more accessible and appropriate than feminist tracts or religious pamphlets to teach everyone about safe, consensual, and satisfactory sex. I'll ask you to be optimistic about porn. This will allow me to prove how pornography can be one of the biggest allies of the feminist movement, how it can be the basis for the fight for LGBTQIA+ equality, and how not only does it have a place in sexual education, but how it can become a fundamental part of it. This is the main point I would like to make tonight, that watching porn is fundamental to one's political education. Porn can translate the value of freedom. Watching different types of porn can be a liberating experience and can open people up to new fantasies and new universes. It can promote not only new ideas, it cannot promote not only access to new forms of pleasure, but it can also create and promote new forms of identity. And I'll argue that exposure to these new, often queer identities on YouPorn is way more effective than in anti-pornographic feminist literature. A platform such as porn can be as subversive to traditional gender roles as it can reinforce them. Secondly, porn can be an extremely effective tool to learn about equality and consent. I'll argue that seeking to restrict access to porn often rests on questionable assumptions and how it often has undesired effects. Restricting porn means restricting the imagination and is the most effective way to reinforce the traditional conservative idea of sexuality. Sexual liberation and freedom requires exposure to new ideas, and this can only be achieved through access to pornography. Restricting access to porn also means restricting access to good porn, porn we can learn from, porn we want to watch. And all this restriction lies on the fundamentally poor and paternalistic assumption that whoever watches porn can't discern what's right or wrong. It lies on the notion that good porn doesn't cancel out bad porn, and that therefore porn itself needs to be canceled. So as a final preamble to my arguments tonight, I'd like to acknowledge that not all porn provides the safe, healthy platform it should, and I would like it to. Porn is a medium, a platform, just like many things are in life. And every platform has its faults. Fixing porn is as important as porn is to sexual education. So before I fully expound on my arguments tonight, it's my absolute pleasure to commence the introductions, or foreplay, of this debate. by introducing the speakers that will speak opposite me tonight. The first is my dear friend, Olivia Lee, the Society's Director of Sponsorship. Olivia has made an excellent input into the organization of this porn debate. So good, in fact, was her input that Genevieve, our president, publicly congratulated her and instructed the entire Leave Committee to, and I quote, look at porn. Whether or not she meant the debate spreadsheet or actual porn, we will never know. The second is Kitsu Edgerton, a member of the Society's Standing Committee. Having spoken to Kitsu before the debate, he suggested that I open my speech by making a joke about how the student speakers on the opposition bench constituted what was essentially my dream threesome. In trying to come up with a witty response, I realized that this wasn't far from true. So tonight, instead of making a disparaging joke about Kitsu's earring, I'm simply going to thank him for opening me up to some new ideas. And I'll say, see you later. Following Kitsu, we have the honor from hearing from Maggie Atkinson, a teacher turned child commissioner for England. And finally, closing the case for the proposition, is everyone's childhood friend, Lisa Ann. Madam President, these are our speakers, and they are most welcome. So let's begin. Let's consider the current state of sexual education. Imagine a classroom. It's stuffy. You're a 15-year-old boy. You come from a moderately conservative household, and you think that you may be bisexual, but you're uncomfortable with coming out. The sex ed curriculum you're learning from was written by a bunch of older straight white men and only explains the very traditional conservative view of sexual relations between men and women. After all, sexual education without porn is restricted to the whim of your local legislator, who doesn't particularly care about most people. Your teacher is a bit uptight, and you suspect that she feels the same. So you're in a classroom, and your teacher mechanically explains how sex should work, explaining that men must wear protection and women must make sure to give consent. But you have a question. How does it work when a woman wants to sleep with another woman, or a man with another man? Obviously, that stuffy classroom is filled with really judgmental peers of yours, and a teacher that you don't feel is particularly liberal. You don't want to be humiliated or embarrassed by a question. What if your question is so basic everyone laughs at you? So you don't ask, and the consequence of that is you don't learn. That is the fundamental problem with the current forms of sexual education as they exist. They are restricted, and they restrict one's imagination because they're totally dependent on the people that take charge of your sexual education, a teacher and a state legislator. They can be conservative or they can be understanding, but that's not the point. The point is fundamentally the quality of your sexual education and your access to a clean, safe, and satisfying sex life is dependent on the bunch of people that you don't particularly know and that you don't particularly choose. This fundamentally deprives you of the sexual education that is necessary to living to a healthy life. What if you live in Texas, where it turns out that 60% of public school districts teach abstinence-based porn? And this is why I'll argue tonight that pornography is actually very similar to the political values that I hold dear to my heart. Why pornography is so synonymous with freedom. Why exposure to new ideas about sex is just as important exposure about new ideas about government and freedom. And how sex and sexuality and the instruction thereof is fundamental to children. And that an atmosphere that is safe is even more fundamental to that instruction. Therefore, One's sexual education is not only shaped by a closed social bubble in which you have no control over, it also exists in the private sphere. And that private sphere should not be restricted by anything that exists in the public. To want to police this fundamental right to sexual exploration, sexual fantasy, and sexual knowledge not only limits sexual representation, but it also obscures the ethical differences between thought, desire, and action. These are three very different processes, and one doesn't mechanically lead to the last. The paternalistic notion that porn is bad, children watch it, and therefore children is bad, ignores their ability to understand what is right and wrong, and fundamentally, and more importantly, it obscures the learning process that is so important to an autonomous sex life. It sacrifices the importance of representation based on the idea that porn is always mimetic of social injustice. Tonight, I would like to argue the opposite, that porn is actually phantasmatic, that it depends on what's fantasy and whims, and that if porn needs any regulation, it's in terms of what fantasies are deemed acceptable, not who gets to watch it. This brings me to my second point, that pornography can help convey the value of equality. Not all women are traumatized or silenced by pornography. Some women enjoy it as consumers in a way that transgress or defy, rather than enforce, social norms or erroneous beliefs about women's nature. Anti-porn feminists overlook and marginalize unconventional and diverse forms of sexual expression that some women enjoy and some women require. Indeed, we should view pornography as a tool for subverting sexual norms and empowering women by enabling them to resist sexual repression and sexist constructions of feminine respectability. Porn can convey whatever message it wants to, and this is a responsibility that I'm the first to admit. But on this basis, we shouldn't discount the role porn could play in sexual education. Rather, we should recognize porn can be better, safer, more values-based, and that porn is more useful than any eggplant and condom in any classroom. Porn can prove that female pleasure matters too, and this has to do with the representation of women in pornography. Feminist pornography, which has existed since the 80s, can represent women who assert sexual agency, where the sexual norms that dominate the real world can be subverted. Porn can be the source of progressive feminist change if we want it to. In fact, porn can be one of the most important tools of teaching progressive sexual relations, because the beauty of porn is that we get to choose what goes in it. And this is where I feel most comfortable with my argument, and that's why I chose this side of the debate tonight. It's because porn is progressing as an industry, becoming more ethical, becoming more feminist. Responsible porn is the future of sexual education, if we can get there. There is a range of porn that objectifies women, and I'd like to be very careful not to condone that tonight. But on that basis, it's impossible to deny that there's a whole host of new feminist porn that helps change what porn means and the values it signals, namely freedom, equality, and representation. If we care enough about porn's place in sexual education, then, and only then, can we begin to rid porn of its dubious tendencies. Porn is a platform, a precious one that is much better than any classroom, and as I said, better than any cucumber anywhere. So tonight, to conclude, I'll ask you to give porn a chance to become a more responsible platform. I've argued that porn means freedom, that it means representation, and that it can be a vector for equality and social change. It can platform marginalized voices. It can help the feminist movement. It can be one of the main vectors for LGBTQIA+ equality by showing people instead of demonizing identities from a textbook. If we want a generation that is free from the shackles of our surroundings and the stigma that currently exists around sex, and in my opinion, worsens quite a lot of the situation regarding sex, I believe it's not porn we should blame, but rather sexual education, the way it's taught today. So I'll end by saying that porn shouldn't just have a place in sexual education. Actually, it must, if we can get porn where it needs to be. Thank you.